Hey readers and writers, I'm Adrian Buskey, and this is Fictitious, a show about the storytelling craft of science fiction and fantasy. Caitlin Starling is the author of The Death of Jane Lawrence, Yellow Jessamine, and The Luminous Dead. Her latest novel, Last to Leave the Room, is a sci-fi thriller set in the fictional West Coast city of San Siroco. Dr. Tamsin Rivers heads an ambitious and secretive research project for a company called Miraca Dynamics. Most of Tamsin's work occurs deep underground, in secluded lab nodes hidden around San Siroco. When her team discovers a disturbing anomaly, the entire city is sinking at an initially unnoticeable but alarmingly consistent rate. Tamsin is charged with diagnosing the problem and approaching city leadership on what to do about it. But while the rest of the city is drifting downwards at the same speed, Tamsin's own basement has been pushed measurably deeper, and not by sinking, but by stretching, the entire room elongating steadily while somehow retaining structural and visual integrity. Tamsin is concerned that her work on the secret project at Miraca might be the cause of all of this, but why is the phenomenon different at her house? Her fascination becomes obsession when she returns home to discover a door in the basement wall, where there had not been one before, a door she cannot open, cannot permanently damage, and cannot see beyond. An increasingly fixated Tamsin creates excuses to work from home, letting her job duties slide as she tests and ponders the door in isolation. But nothing prepares her for when the door finally opens, and a carbon copy of herself walks through to greet her. Last to Leave the Room is potent and surreal horror-inflected science fiction coming October 10th from St. Martin's Press. And Caitlin Starling, welcome back to Fictitious.
Thank you for having me back.
I'm so excited when any book of yours drops onto my desk. And I gotta tell you, I went through like a massive reading slump in the couple of years while Fictitious was off and just kind of dealing with my own personal BS. It was a while where I just kind of had a hard time finding things that I liked. And even now, like I've got tons and tons of books arriving at my door, trying to absorb a lot of fiction right now. And there's something so nice about even digging into the first chapter of one of your books, because I love your prose so much. I love the way that you build stories. And there's just a comfort of like sliding and being like, good writing, good effing writing, you know? Now, comfort is the last thing that anybody would probably associate with your work because it does have such tension built into it, and you play so much with claustrophobia and making the world around a character melt away until everything is their own psychosis almost. But we'll get more into that because I feel like there are some hallmarks of your work that appear even as you go across wildly different kinds of genres, which is a thing that I enjoy. But as we dig into this, I tried to give a entry into this story without getting too much beyond the appearance of Prime, which we'll talk a little bit more later. But how do you pitch this story? When you say, okay, here's what this book is, what do you say?
It's basically just a very short version of what you said, which is, as shady scientist Tamsin Rivers races to figure out if her research is causing the sinking of the city she lives in, she must also hide the damning accelerated movement of her own basement, and then her doppelganger walks out of a door that shouldn't exist. Literally the exact same scope, just compacted down. I also sometimes say, this is a COVID novel that's not about COVID, but clearly is about COVID. As in, COVID does not appear in the pages. It is never referenced. But if you're reading it, you're going to be like, oh, yeah. Right. I remember that time. Well, at least people who were able to remote into work. It's in that crossover sci-fi horror, contemporary sci-fi horror realm. Sometimes whether my stuff is actually horror or not comes up as a question. For some people, it's very horrific. For some people, they're like, well, why is this shelved in this section of the bookstore? So it's a little bit divisive, but I think overall it lands pretty squarely in that contemporary, mad scientist horror zone. It's got some thriller aspects to it, especially with the initial pacing of it, but I wouldn't say that it's structured like a thriller.
It's interesting that you bring that up, that like different people kind of view it in a different way, because it's something I've kind of seen a lot. There are, some books that so squarely land in here's epic fantasy or here's like military sci-fi or something like that. And then you have a lot of stuff that kind of seems to kind of drift in between, and it really depends on the person's own definition of those things. Because for me, like this counts as horror because there's a psychological horror. It touches on a surrealism kind of thing. It's kind of Black Mirror-esque, I think, is like if I was telling somebody like, what they were looking for. And to me, Black Mirror so perfectly blends like technological sci-fi with horror, at least in the existential way that I imagine it. For other people, it means it's got to be body horror, or there has to be gore, or there has to be monsters, or whatever. I see it even like in science fiction where sometimes you'll have something that'll be like, oh, this is space opera, but is it hard sci-fi or is it military sci-fi or whatever? And some people are really glued to those definitions. So I'm always curious about how those things get marketed. It was funny. I had Greta Kelly on this show not too long ago, and she was talking about how like there are some genres that you can't say out loud in a pitch. Like you never say steampunk because that doesn't ever
Hmm.
sell. Things like that. So you have to be careful about how you pitch them. You mentioned this is a book that comes out of the COVID era, as far as like the sort of work from home isolation thing that takes place here. Can you kind of pinpoint that origin story a little bit more directly? Like, where did this come up from? What kind of generated these ideas? What were you playing with when it came together?
So I came up with this in the, let me see, summer of 2021. There was actually a pretty fast turnaround on this, all told. And I drew on a couple things that already existed in my brain. One was the character Tamsin Rivers is based off of, if anyone's read Yellow Jessamine or heard me talk about Yellow Jessamine, Evelyn in that book is also a very old character of mine. Evdocia in The Death of Jane Lawrence is also a very old character of mine. This is a character from the kind of same era of teenage Caitlin's brain. But that version of her, there's a major thing that happens to her in the book about two-thirds of the way through, and my idea of this character was always post that thing happening. But I realized I could tell the story of that event occurring. I made a ton of changes to it. It's no longer anything like it was back when I was a teenager, but that was the seed of her character. And I also at one point had written, I used to write a lot of fan fiction, still do sometimes, and I had written a fanfic for the game Dishonored, where I was basically challenging myself to write something in the style of Lovecraft, just because I had actually never read any of it. I finally read some of it and was like, I could steal parts of this. I could break it down for parts, take some of the style parts. And I wrote something about a basement that was sinking into the city while the character Piero, who's one of the mad scientists in that game, was watching it and becoming obsessed with it. So I took these two things and I was like, you know what? I've been stuck in this apartment for a year and a half now. I'm just going to put all three together, mix it all up, and see what comes out. But I'm not actually sure where the doppelganger part came from. I think I just was like, okay, there's this door. The door always was there. What's going to come out of that door? What is the worst thing that could come out of that door for this character in particular? And I was like, you know what? It's herself.
I think that is perfect because, and we'll talk a little bit more later about Tamsin Rivers and the type of person that she is. But when you have somebody who is super ambitious, who's kind of cold, who's kind of shady, like you referenced her earlier, the idea that a person like that may, idealize themselves above everything else, but absolutely would not want to meet their replica, let alone find one that is more empathetic and likable than they are. Which is the
Mm-hmm.
case when Prime emerges. And again, we'll talk about that in a little bit. But I really like that idea of what's the worst thing that could appear, not a monster, not, a black hole, none of those things. Just, nope, yourself walking back out and being like, hi.
Yeah, I think if this book had a tagline, it would just be, do you trust yourself?
That's so good.
Or should you trust yourself?
Right. Yeah.
Yeah, because I think most people would be like, oh yeah, no, like I can predict what I would do. Yeah, I'm fine. Yeah, but when you can predict what you would do and it's not good for you, if you're a very ambitious, very cutthroat person, someone who's just like you is going to be difficult to deal with. And then particularly if they're not acting the way you expect, because you're like, okay, what game are they playing? What's the angle here? They're exactly like me in every other respect, so why are they acting in a way that I can't predict?
Yeah. Because whether it's within ourselves or within the environments that we are most familiar with, that alterations that we can't pinpoint can make us kind of crazy. I feel like
Mm-hmm.
if you go into the office and somebody moved a desk over, you'd be like, yeah, somebody was here and moved a desk. Why did they do that? You wouldn't think too heavily about it. But when you go into your house and something's different, and I think we've all kind of had it, whether it's like, oh, there's a weird stain on the wall, or there's just something shifted slightly out of place, and you don't know, did I do that? Did my spouse do that? Do I live with anybody? And just the kind of momentary paranoia that those kinds of things can generate. I think this story takes that sort of paranoia and ratchets to 11 and then layers in a lot of these questions of identity, whether or not could you trust yourself? Can you trust another version of yourself and those things? So I like all of those things that it plays with. And I like that Tamsin's world gets kind of smaller and smaller while the mystery gets bigger and bigger. And I think structurally that's very interesting. Thinking about the world this is set in. So this is basically modern/near future. It's a little
Yeah.
ambiguous in the novel. Like, is that an accurate way to describe it?
Yeah, I didn't push technology very far into the future. I tried to go based on what I know that we could do now. I'm not particularly a futurist or anything, so going too far in the future would be just pulling things out of a hat. Yeah, I would say, at most it's, a couple years in the future. It's not very far at all.
So you've got this city that's kind of near San Francisco. It's a bit smaller, a bit tidier. It's a newer city, so that it's like,
Hmm.
but its infrastructure kind of sucks. So America Dynamics basically kind of moves in and ingratiates themselves by like helping to fix the city's subway, but it's
Hmm.
really a subversive means for them to be able to work on a bigger experiment with not a lot of oversight, with a lot of these like buried, what they refer to as nodes, or these testing facilities. And again, there's another bit of obscurity in here, which is that like we know that Tamsin and Mirka are working on something, but you're not very explicit about what that thing is. And so I'm kind of curious about that choice in the writing to kind of put something that's like, here's this kind of mysterious project, here's some hints about what it is, and it may impact all of these things, but you're not telling us what it is. Like, what was the thinking on that end?
The more detail I went into about it, more it slowed the pacing down, the less scary things got, the more the focus became on picking apart if the sci-fi made sense, which, the physics in this book do not make sense. The characters, in fact, explicitly state that things are not behaving the way that they can explain. And that's intentional. But we're not here to play solve the mystery. The mystery is a more internal mystery than an external mystery. But what the overall company is doing is, Google and Amazon and every other tech giant, they've got their main products and they've got the competitors' products that they've absorbed, and they've got the R&D that they very occasionally talk about, but most of the time don't talk about. And so in my mind, America, one of their subsidiary companies makes meal kits that Tamsin eats a lot of, and they basically also own a Soylent clone. I'm sure they're also partially a lifestyle brand. But what they're paying her to work on in particular, and the details we do get about it, is basically a way to have instantaneous communication without needing to rely on cell service or Wi-Fi or any of that. Basically, they're trying to disrupt the communications industry by using it's not the quantum entanglement type idea that often I've read about. I had a friend tell me, that stuff would never work anyway if you actually understand the physics. I'm like, okay, well, I'll cross that off the board. But it's more of, if you've read Underland by Robert McFarlane, which is about mines and mushrooms and basically everything that goes on under the surface of the planet, because it's an interesting place. I've written an entire book about that.
I was going to say Lumina's dead, mines, mushrooms, all
Yeah.
that. Yeah.
But one of the things he talks about is research into particle physics, where they do have these deep underground labs because the Earth actually does a lot of shielding. And so you can get a very, very quiet place by building a room down there where you can look for things that otherwise get drowned out. So the premise of the tenuous science in the book is that they are trying to use that quiet in order to send particular signals with no interference, because it's bypassing a lot of the rest of the noise of the universe. And it does seem to be working, but we don't really get to see what that would cause, because it appears to be having some knock-on effects as well.
So that actually was something I was thinking about when I was reading it, was that like this kind of story thematically and how some of it is approached, I think we'd often see it done as like a short story, particularly because short stories allow us to hand wave everything and
Mm-hmm.
not ask any questions, right? When you get long form, you get 300 and 400 pages long. That's when like the audience starts either, if they are non-critical, they don't ask those questions because it's not really of interest to them, which is kind of like, it's always been the space opera versus sci-fi thing, hard sci-fi,
Mm-hmm.
because if you don't care, then you're like, it doesn't matter, just tell me a good story. But some people will fiddle over the details with
Yes.
it. And so that was the thing I wondered here, was like, initially, was this always a full novel idea? Were you approaching it as short fiction? Anything like that? Was there an evolutionary change somewhere along the way?
It was always a full novel, and the focus of the novel has always been on Tamsin and her double, which is why, in some ways, the science is the set dressing to get us into the story, and isn't so much the main question or the main solution.
There's also a thing in here, and I kind of touched on this a little bit earlier, but like we talked back in the day about The Luminous Dead, and I've been very open about the fact that that's been one of my favorite novels of the last 10 years, and I recommend it constantly. That's a small cast novel in a big place, in the sense that Gyre is underground in this big cave system, but is otherwise very isolated. There's nobody
Mm-hmm.
else there, just somebody over a comm link. And there is a claustrophobia that is constantly working in that novel. I would say to a degree that The Death of Jane Lawrence has a similar kind of thing,
Mm-hmm.
that like once she enters the house and the environment there, that there is also this kind of, I don't know the technical way but to describe it, but when you watch a film and they change the camera lens and you see everything shift in and like things get tighter and zooms in on
Mm-hmm.
them and everything else kind of falls away. I felt like Jane Lawrence kind of has that going on. And I think that's here too. And so,
Mm-hmm.
but all three of those novels are drastically different from each other. You know, whether it's the genre of them, the conceits of them, but it does seem like something that you do very well as far as creating this sense of tension through that. I'm curious in this instance how you approach going from something where it's big in a city, in a larger environment. There are workplaces. Occasionally she's at like a restaurant slash bar slash speakeasy kind of thing. But then it tightens up and tightens up and tightens up until her world is very small. When you're approaching something like that, what advantages does that give you in creating the story? What challenge does it create? Is it a conscious thing that you're thinking about, like thematically, that you like playing with those ideas?
It's definitely conscious. I like getting my characters as alone as possible. In this case, it was fun getting her alone with herself in a very real, externalized fashion instead of just being stuck with her own thoughts like Gyre has been, like Jane was for a while. It's just like with how the broader science ideas, science fiction ideas behind the plot, past a certain point, they're not really useful. And same thing with the rest of the city. It's useful as a contrast to what she's doing, which is why we have video chats with her colleagues where they can kind of pick up that something is going wrong and she is to better or worse extent able to hide it from them. And she still has to interact with the outside world. She has to find a way to do it without leaving her house. But a lot of it was the tightening in was mirroring my actual experience with COVID lockdown because so I went from living where I live now, very familiar with the neighborhood, with everything, and then not leaving my house, but it was okay because I knew how to get stuff done still. And then we moved across the country for my husband to do his master's degree, and I was in a new apartment where I did not know the neighborhood, and I could still get by because the internet makes many things available and money makes many things available, and it was fine. But with all of that taken away, with all the familiarity taken away, I started developing agoraphobia. And I remember I was about to leave the apartment to get my first COVID vaccine shot, and my brain just started spinning, and my thoughts were just going, and I felt absolutely terrible. And it wasn't that I was thinking about going outside. It was everything else I was thinking about became catastrophically horrible. I felt terrible. I felt like I, was going to be sick, and I was like, I can't do this. There's something wrong. I'm going to need to reschedule it. And then I finally realized it was referred anxiety from the thing I wasn't thinking about, which was going outside for the first time in months, basically. My husband had been going to do the grocery shopping without me. I had not left the building I was in months. So when I started writing Tamsin, I was like, man, I want to write that moment where you don't know why you're angry and scared of everything, because it's insane that it would be about going outside. And it just that little trick that your brain does of not thinking about the thing it's afraid of, because that would be too scary. So then you can't figure out why there's a problem. And so I built that into what is going wrong with her, coming back to that idea of the true problem is not her research, but is her being stuck with herself and what that might mean. And I was like, okay, well, that's a fun thing. That's not just, two people potentially manipulating each other. That's a very physical thing that could be explained by the fact that she hasn't been going outside, but could also be a symptom of something far worse.
Yeah, I think like a lot of us went through, especially people like me. I'm a big time extrovert, and then I should say I was, and then over the course of the pandemic, things changed a lot for me, and now I feel more insular and more comfortable staying a little bit more isolated. And so, yeah, going back out into the world can be very strange. There was a thing that you said there that I liked a lot too, which was that she's basically essentially on Zoom calls like we are right now, with her coworkers, and they're used to her being this sort of ice queen that is kind of lords over them. And they're starting to see cracks. They're starting to see mistakes. They're starting to see her completely lose track of parts of her own history and way she has interacted with people as a direct result of things happening in her home and with this doppelganger. And that was the thing I liked, because like I think a lot of people who have been in the work from home situation, especially when things were very difficult, and remain very difficult for a lot of people, but where you're looking at somebody that you talk to every day over a screen and then trying to diagnose, does it seem like they're more tired? Does it seem like they're more distracted? Do they look a little more frazzled? Is their hair not quite right? There's a dishevelment there that is just they're working and it's hard, or is there something wrong? And trying to figure out at what point do you say to somebody across the screen, are you okay? Is maybe a little bit harder to do than it would be in person. So I liked that the extrapolation of that idea of taking like that existence that a lot of us have lived over the last few years and figuring out like what happens when there is an external source that has elevated that experience quite a lot. Let's talk a little bit more about Tamsin. So you have this character who's extremely smart, very, very talented, a total climber, absolutely ambitious and has this idea that this technological change that she's going to make is going to make her essentially famous isn't the right word, but like, is going to elevate her to that status of like, I'm the genius who changed the world in some way. But what that means is that she's a pretty unlikable protagonist. This is a person who is, for a lot of people, are going to immediately read this and go, I would hate this person. I would absolutely despise this person if I knew them in real life. And that can be a real challenge for some readers. Certainly book to book, I run into that problem sometimes. How do you anchor your story with a protagonist that is this challenging? How do you make the audience come in and care about the story? How do you endear them? That may not be the right term for it, but how do you create that engagement for them with somebody that they may not really care for?
This is why she has a cat. that is partially a joke and partially not a joke, because when I was developing this idea, which I did with my editor was giving me feedback as I was working through the early stages of it. My editor, Sylvan, was like, I think it was Sylvan. It might have been my agent. One of them was like, this is going to be an unlikable character. You need to give her something that she cares about that we can sympathize with, like a cat. It doesn't have to actually be a cat, but just think about her having a cat. And I went, you know what? She has a cat. And the cat actually became, as my friend put it, a load-bearing cat. Plot-relevant cat. And there are a couple other things, but that was like the start of how do I make this character more sympathetic. I'm actually really glad to hear that she is not likable, because I actually, personally, I feel like I have a hard time writing unlikable characters because I am personally a people pleaser. So sometimes that, especially on first drafts, soaks into my writing and I have to yank it back. So I'm glad that Tamsin comes across as very, very irritating in some ways, at least at the beginning. But along with the cat, I feel like putting her in context with Prime, who at first she's always the foil to Tamsin. At first, Prime is very nice. And, this is a horror novel, so I think we can all understand that maybe something might change there at some point. And so Tamsin looks even worse in comparison. But we also can see kind of, okay, but Tamsin could be like that, maybe. Couldn't she? Like, is Prime completely different from her, or is she identical? Because if she's identical, it's a possibility that Tamsin could become more like her over time. And then there's also another character who we haven't talked about yet, which is Lachlan Woodfield, who's her handler, basically there to make sure she doesn't cut and run and take corporate secrets somewhere else and to make sure she's still working properly. Very intimidating figure who she nevertheless has some delightful sexual tension with, but who's also there, who is able to push back. I think if Tamsin didn't have someone who was able to put her in her place when necessary, we would lose some sympathy for her. But as it is, we have this mysterious, threatening figure, but enticing, threatening figure who is basically, at some points, potentially even rooting for to see what's going on and try and help Tamsin. And I think all those together, there's always a potential that she's going to change what she's doing. And I think that that's necessary. If she was static, if she was just this ambitious, cold person the entire book, I don't think it would work at all. But instead, we have these pressures on her, pulling her in different ways, trying to make her behave differently, whether for good reason or not.
I feel like I need to put up a plaque for load-bearing cat. I know that's a throwback to the early part of that comment, but that so has stuck in my brain because I love that idea, that element.
The actual phrase, it wasn't actually about the cat. It's on a book that I wrote previous to Last to Leave the Room that did not get picked up by my publisher. We're still looking for a home for it, which is an epic fantasy horror. That one is where my friend coined the term, but what she was talking about was load-bearing cannibalism. I believe I have a text somewhere saying the cannibalism is load-bearing, darling, or something similar to that. But the cat is also load-bearing, and there's no cannibalism in Last to Leave the Room, I feel like I should say.
I feel like you've broken me with that one. Load-bearing cannibalism is, I want that on a t-shirt just so people will walk up and just go, I want to know, but I don't want to know, right?
I have a list of phrases that one day I want to turn into those badge ribbons that you could get at like Worldcon and stuff.
Uh-huh.
And I think that that's going to go on there.
That's amazing. Well, using Penrose, the cat, as a way to increase, a certain identifiability makes a lot of sense. And a cat is the perfect kind of character for somebody like Tamsin, as far as being a relatively low maintenance, and cats being notoriously both affectionate and assholes simultaneously, that works right alongside her. I like that you mentioned Lachlan too, because the thing I enjoy about a character like that is that they are sort of hovering in the periphery for a lot of the story, with just enough mystery about them that you have this woman who is very, very serious, ominous in her presence a lot of the time. It has things like always wears gloves, never takes them off, seems to know things about Tamsin's home life that she shouldn't know, as far as like
Mm-hmm.
calling her at 5:30 in the morning when Tamsin is up and being like, why are you up? Like, why do you know that about me? Why would you have guessed that? But also, interestingly, having moments where there's a scene that I love where Tamsin is on a call with Lachlan, and Lachlan says something that she should take as threatening, but Tamsin is more weirded out because she realizes that it's a sound of concern. That kind of switch, and having somebody who feels like they are this hovering presence, and then that presence is like more worried about your welfare than keeping you in line, and that is a
Mm-hmm.
disturbing thing. It's such a small piece, but that's the kind of character piece that really stands out to me, to making something that feels authentic and feels like it hits closer to a real emotional beat. Especially for somebody like a Tamsin, who probably usually doesn't care if anybody gives a shit about her because she doesn't care about them. That switch is fascinating to me. So I liked that a lot. There are a number of kind of surreal, disorienting sequences. Initially, you've got moments where it feels like Tamsin might actually be sleepwalking, or, at first it's like, is it just some sort of intense nightmare? Which those are always tricky to put into books because they can feel kind of frivolous and throwaway. But here, there's a consequence to those nighttime dreams slash, sleepwalking. And increasingly, that surreality points out times when her own identity is starting to kind of get fractured. Now, we've mentioned Prime, and I don't know if we've explained enough about that character, and I don't want to give too much away about it, but
Yeah.
essentially, when that door opens in her basement and another version of her walks out, she suddenly has this whole other human being, or at least she's trying to figure out if it is a human being, in her home that looks like her, sounds like her, but doesn't quite act like her initially. And so suddenly she has to, like, she's a person who lives alone with her cat, and now she's got this new other human being, also another cat, that she has to figure out how to deal with, both from a scientific level and from a psychological way, as far as like, evaluating her own reactions to things.
In a logistical way. Where do you keep this person? There's no bathroom in your basement, so you could lock them in your basement, but is that too far of a step for, Tamsin to take? Where does she stop herself? What is she willing to do in order to keep this thing at a remove, keep it and study it? And can she study it while she's so afraid of it? And all of these different things are in play from the moment that it steps out. And it isn't it at first, at least, even though it looks like her. She can't think of it as another her because that's a bit too much.
Right. You have to keep her removed there so she can
Mm-hmm.
think about it critically rather than emotionally.
Well, she can pretend to think about it critically, yeah.
Right.
I would argue that whenever you think Tamsin is thinking critically, you should kind of look to see if there's a little corner you can peel up and see what she's actually feeling. She may not say it. She doesn't always, I don't always narrate what she's feeling, but you can sometimes see what she's refusing to admit that she's feeling.
Right. But like I was talking about with the surreal aspect, I think this is a challenge whenever any writer attempts to do these kinds of things, because they can be deliciously descriptive and really like immersive. But for some readers, they can also kind of eject them because people can get kind of confused. Some people need like a really, really concrete narrative. Other ones are much more comfortable with something that skews a little bit off of reality. How did you manage those kinds of sequences, and especially as it escalates for her world and life, and the fracturing of her identity as the story goes along? And what was the kind of like editorial feedback on that stuff?
The most important thing for those is just time. Like if I come back 6 months later and I can't tell what the hell I was trying to say, there's no chance a reader's going to be able to tell. The way my brain works is usually pretty literal. So luckily there's, I don't just get swept up in the language when I come back to it. I don't just glaze over it. I'm like, okay, wait a second. What is this phrase is very pretty. What does it mean? Because I can't figure out what it means. So that was the majority of it, but also just making sure that any sequence like that had an effect, like you said, an effect on the story. It's not just, oh, and then she woke up and she was scared of it. It's, okay, wait a minute. She wakes up and she's somewhere else than she started. And how did that happen? Or, okay, she wakes up and then later finds footage of herself from during the time she was asleep, which then gives a little bit additional context. But I also try and have, a rising and falling action to each one of those moments. There's a mini plot in those surreal moments, even if we can't understand why the characters are doing something. It builds and it crests, and then there's an outcome to it. And I think having that kind of rise and fall helps it be a little bit more concrete, even if the details are wobbly and shifting.
Whenever people are writing a novel, they're often told, obviously, if you have a protagonist, you need some kind of antagonist, or classic ideas of like man versus animal versus
Mhm.
whatever those things are when you're trying to figure out what is the opposite opposing force. In this situation, I feel like it could kind of go a lot of different ways because the situation itself is kind of, a conflict, as far as like, a sinking city. That's a problem and a lot of
Mhm.
logistical problems at work in it. But you also have the anomaly within the house and the challenge that creates to a person's own reality. And then Tamsin alongside of Prime, which causes her to examine her own nature to figure out how those things are shifting. That in its own way is kind of an antagonist. So when you're approaching something like this, when you're structuring it and putting these ideas together, did you outline this? Did you kind of know where that was going? Is it something that developed? Like, at what point where you were like, okay, this is the true conflict of the story?
It was fully outlined because my publisher required that before they would buy it. I was told I could redo the outline entirely after they approved it, but that I needed a full outline at least and some sample chapters. I actually I didn't make too many changes to the outline except for I reconfigured the opening quarter. Basically up until I'm trying to think. It's a little bit past when Prime first arrives. My original plan worked okay, but it was a little bit too much of a steady build as opposed to having its own mini arcs. So I ended up shuffling a couple scenes around and expanding a couple others. But for the most part, I had it planned from the beginning. I would say that it's man versus self or woman versus self, both very obviously because we have an externalized self, we have Prime, but also Tamsin's own actions cause lots of problems for herself, as many of my characters do. They are their own worst enemy in most cases. So there's a thing with doppelganger stories where there are a couple different types, and there's actually a bit where Tamsin is doing research on this and kind of finds out these things just because not everyone studied English lit, including me. I had to research it myself. But doppelganger stories follow like, a couple general plots. The two distinct types are like one is where the character never directly interacts with their doppelganger. It's like a haunting that they see them across the street or they talk to their friends and their friends are like, well, when you did X, Y, and Z, and you're like, I've never done those things. And it always slowly destroys their life. Or where they know their doppelganger and they usually become obsessed. And at some point they try, and in all these, they usually try and kill the doppelganger. Most of the time, if you can get that far, you end up killing yourself in the process. Even to the very literal, you stab someone, you stab your doppelganger, and a wound appears on you, and the doppelganger is just standing there with your knife laughing. Like, that's your traditional thing. The doppelganger is, at best, and very rarely neutral. It is usually an externalization of all of your worst traits. Tamsin is already the externalization of all of her worst traits. So, as we've hinted at, Prime is the opposite. Prime is potentially her good traits or traits that she doesn't acknowledge or want to talk about. And flipping kind of the expectation of what the doppelganger is like really kind of let me dig into that Tamsin versus herself because she is constantly being her morals and her lack of morals, her willingness to get ahead, her own fears, her ambitions, they're constantly being thrown back in her face, but in ways that she is not prepared to deal with. Because with a character like Tamsin, she doesn't care if you throw those things in her face, unless you do it in a way she's never experienced before and never expected. And having this doppelganger, one of the things that comes up a couple times in the narration is that she feels horror and disgust when she sees Prime be vulnerable, which, any psychologist would have a field day with. It's not supposed to be subtle. It's, she, instead of feeling like, oh, I should take care of this person because it's wearing her face, she's disgusted by it and it freaks her out badly. And then she freaks out about her own experience of being freaked out. The mirror is a funhouse mirror, and just like, it does the normal doppelganger thing. It shows you something you don't want to see, but the thing that she's seeing is not the standard, oh, here I am murdering and abducting women or whatever, which is the usual doppelganger story.
It really terrifies me because there was a brief period of time, or I should say, actually, it wasn't brief, it was years, where I had my own doppelganger in my home area who people would literally approach me sometimes and start having conversations with me. And I'd be like, I'm sorry, I'm at a loss. I don't know you. And they'd be like, we work together. And I'd be like, I don't know who you are. And they'd be like, aren't you Dimitri? And I'd be like, I am not. And it happened to me in high school too, where like several times people would come up to me and be like, oh man, that was so awesome. We heard you kick that guy's ass at the rock pile last night. And I'd be like, I was at Hardy's talking about D&D. What do we, I did what? I don't know. I've never met him, but apparently he's still around because one of my friends saw him not too long ago. But anyway.
Wasn't it you who also, you'd gone caving and you fell through a hole underwater?
Yes,
Was that? Yeah,
that's
you
me.
always have these very weird, creepy connections to the stuff I decide to write about.
There's probably a reason why your stuff connects so well for me because, yes, I mean, I have disappeared under the water in a cave, so I understood the existential dread attached to the luminous dead in a big way. I want to talk a little bit. I mentioned a couple times as far as editorial, and you mentioned that you had to outline this and everything. I want to go super heavy on the previous books or anything, but we have talked before about the fact that like editorial had a massive impact on the Luminous Dead.
Yes.
Like that the original version of that novel versus the one that hit shelves are wildly, radically, completely different books in a lot of ways. Over the course of the novels that you've done since, how has that process kind of, that evolution been? Now that was a different publisher, I'm a different editor, and you are now a much more established writer. What's that experience been like, when you get to this point, this far on into things, especially when you're writing different genres or different subgenres every time?
Yeah, so The Luminous Dead and The Death of Jane Lawrence were both drafted before I even had an agent. So that does skew things quite a bit. Both of them were fully formed and edited, to an extent, novels before they got to an actual editor. And so it's a much bigger lift, of course, when they wanted you to change something like with The Luminous Dead. The entire second half of the book got completely restructured and rewritten in about 3 or 4 weeks. The Death of Jane Lawrence, most of those big changes happened before we went on submission with it, but it was still, the book existed, and then I had to shake it up and remix it and redo a bunch. We were planning on doing essentially the same thing with my third book, with my second book with St. Martin's Press, in that I'm a relatively fast drafter, and at the time, my agent and my experience was that I write good first drafts, good early versions, but we always find a major change to make that makes it just that much better. So she was like, you know what? You can't submit your option book to this publisher until March. It's October. You've got this idea for this epic fantasy horror novel. Why don't you just write it? Do you feel up to just writing it? It's, it's COVID, you're not, it wasn't going out anyway. And I sat down and I wrote that novel, and I really loved it, and my agent really loved it, and my editor really loved it, but it was not the correct fit for my publisher, being that it was epic fantasy horror.
Right.
Or at the very least, high fantasy horror. I think high fantasy horror is a better way to put it, because it's not epic in scope, but it's still, full on knights, castles, magic, slightly broader scope. It's really fun. It is the book that I've referred to on social media as Fucky Bee's book a couple times, and it has the load-bearing cannibalism.
You mentioned that phrase the last time I talked to you when it was you and I and Genevieve Gornichak.
Mm-hmm.
They mentioned the Fucky Bees, and I just remember being like, that was the most intriguing phrase. But you didn't mention load-bearing cannibalism at the time.
It's I would call it American Horror Story in Westeros is probably the closest, the fastest pitch for that one.
Oh,
I love it to pieces. It's currently under consideration somewhere else. I'm fingers crossed that it gets picked up.
Indeed.
But so it got rejected, and I'm sitting there going, well, what do I do now? And my editor was like, well, get on a call with me and we'll figure something out. So we start talking. Because Death of Jane Lawrence was a 1-book deal, so I didn't have any other books under contract. This is just an option for them to maybe pick up. But she's like, I want to, so let's figure this out. We got on a call, and we brainstormed a bunch of ideas. I came in with a couple, small scenario type things, one of which was this sinking basement idea, and I think I maybe had put the doppelganger in at that point. I can't remember. I think it was each idea I had was a paragraph long. And we went back and forth, and we decided, and she talked to her boss, and they liked the doppelganger story. And so she came back and she said, write me a full outline and 3 sample chapters. We did that. And she looked over the outline and was like, if you want to write it this way, this works for me. This sounds like it would work. And whatever changes while you write organically, go for it. And I think I may have emailed her a couple times while I was drafting saying, hey, I think I'm going to make this alteration or whatever else. And she was always, okay, here, thumbs up. She did my first round of developmental edits, then left for a different publisher. And then I had another editor for a while, and now I'm with a third editor. So it's been a wild ride with this one. But it turns out that in editing and revising and editing The Luminous Dead, and revising and editing Jane Lawrence, and writing the Funky Bees book, and writing Yellow Jessamine, I got better at being an author. And so I can now actually anticipate some of my issues and work those out in the outline. And so this time, like I said, there was that one bit that I shuffled around in fairly late in the game in edits because just it wasn't quite feeling right. But other than that, my brain has been trained well enough that it does some of the work subconsciously so that the actual, outlining feels the same, but it comes together much better now.
Is there any kind of structure you were leaning on when you did it? I mean, are you just kind of sitting down and figuring out beat by beat? Or are you thinking about, okay, here's arcs, here's I mean, obviously, there's always stuff like, Save the Cat, 7 point structure, 16 act, whatever, those kinds of things. Does any of that factor in, or are you just kind of flowing with the narrative?
I do a real rough 3 act. That tends to be the same for everything. And I just sort of, I start with, okay, what's the arc of the first act? What's the arc of the second act? What's the arc of the third? Okay, how can I break that down within the arc? And I literally, in this case, just because I had never done an outline from scratch to give to a professional, I took my usual word count and I took the usual word count of my chapters and I divided one by the other. And I said, okay, I've got 40 chapters to do this in, divided those into 3 parts of slightly differing length. And I just started slotting ideas in. I had ideas for certain scenes. I had bits that I'd already, put in the pitch. I fit those in. And then I said, okay, how do I get from point A to point C? What needs to happen at point B? And this is how I usually revise things. I basically just took the skill I'd learned revising books and I moved it earlier in the process. And I outlined it completely out of order just by filling in those slots. And I just looked for scenes that made me excited, that I thought would be fun to write. So I put those in as tent poles and figured out how to make them functional.
So at this point, this book, Last Leave the Room, is coming out in October. We're talking in August. You've got a high fantasy horror novel that's shopping at the moment. What's next? Are you working on the next thing or the next multiple things? Yeah. I mean, obviously, I'm sure you can't talk about them intensely, but what's kind of in the hopper?
Yeah, this is one of those things where I'm not entirely sure what I can talk about, but I haven't been told not to talk about it, so I'm just gonna go for it. I did make a new deal with my publisher. Last Leave the Room is also a 1-book deal. I finally have gotten a 2-book deal.
Yay!
Which is exciting. And the one that I'm working on currently is what I am calling Hospital Gothic. I don't want to go into too much more detail than that, but the eventual publisher's marketplace announcement that we've drafted is something along the lines of, let me just actually pull it up and read it because it's much better than what I'm going to come up with off the fly.
Okay.
In which a patient uncovers a conspiracy while undergoing a high-risk new treatment for her incurable disease.
Fascinating.
Long-term hospital stay with the goal of specifically of it's not the doctors and nurses that are the scary thing. This largely came out of my experience having my child, and I had actually some really great nurses. But I also, having a relatively long-term stay in a hospital is interesting for anyone who's ever been through it. I'm sure they can commiserate that stuff gets weird. Time gets weird. Rhythms of life get weird. I was only in there for like a week, but I still fondly remember being woken up at 5 a.m. for blood draws every day by a different phlebotomist who just suddenly was in my room next to me. And I had a pretty free stay. I was able to move around quite a bit towards the end of it. I wasn't really, I needed some blood transfusions, but aside from that, I was fine. So I've also have lots of exciting things to tell about blood transfusions too these days.
Oh goodness!
Just to add to the little body horror details.
I was going to say, like, hospital is just like a home for body horror. And yeah, if you've done any sort of long-term stay, the fact that you're never really allowed to sleep through a whole night, that the place is never actually quiet, that you're never really alone in any way. The environment is just very, very strange. A newer one, like a newer hospital, erases some of that through like just the surreality is still there, but the modernity of it is like very mundane. But if you've ever been in like in an older place that just feels 10 or 15 years out of date, like that makes things feel really strange. Yeah. All right, well, I'm gonna look forward to that one. Fingers crossed that thing goes through and hits publication relatively soon. Like you said, you're a fast drafter, and this book, it's in about a 2-year turnaround, which for the publishing industry is pretty crazy. Although it feels like things are moving a lot faster these days in general, or at least the demand for things to kind of get out quicker is definitely there. In an era where social media is completely screwed up, where are you at these days? Where should people be following you online?
I am still on, and I'm going to call it Twitter. I don't care. I'm still there. Same place, at @CSEE_Starling. I am also on Blue Sky as at C, the letter, starling.bsky.social. And yes, I'm going to say right now, I've not been particularly consistent in any of my stuff, in how I name myself on various social media. And then I am also occasionally on Instagram at author C Starling. Any of those 3 currently will get to me. We'll see what happens with the artist formerly known as Twitter. It is getting more and more annoying to log into that app, so
it's awful.
Yeah, I would say Blue Sky and Instagram probably. I've considered getting Threads. I don't fully know if I want to do that or not. I'm very lazy when it comes to new social media. It turns out that when you have a small child running around, it becomes a lot less important it does not take up as much space in my brain.
Yeah, I think that's a good thing. Also, just I mean, every additional social media account is a drain on time and attention and energy,
and it just dilutes everything.
Yeah, and when they're so toxic, like Twitter tends to be, and you're learning the ropes of new places, Threads is too wrapped up in Meta's nonsense as far as like just just feeding you advertisers and influencers rather than the people you want to follow. Right now, Blue Sky is a really nice place for writers and readers. That community has really grown in that aspect, but it is also a gated garden while there's still invites going in, and it's already starting to exhibit some of the same kinds of nonsense that Twitter's dealt with. So no space is safe, right? Like they're all, it's still human beings in them, and human beings will mess up any pond that they jump into. So jump into, same thing. It really thought the same thing.
I do have a website that I do keep relatively updated. It's CaitlinStarling.com. There's a newsletter you can sign up for. If you're lucky, you'll get one once a year.
Well, the show notes, the blog, and the YouTube, and all those places, I'll have links to all the places people can follow you and keep up with all of those things. Links to buy Last to Leave the Room. Like I said, that's coming out on October 10th from St. Martin's Press. Where it will be shelved in your local bookstore could be a question, because it could be in horror, it could be in fiction, it could be in sci-fi and fantasy, could be on a nice kiosk somewhere, I imagine. I was in my local Books A Million the other day, and I saw both Jane Lawrence and Luminous Dead shelved on their Hot on Book Talk shelf.
Oh, so, that's exciting.
Yeah, so I don't know if the Book Talk has glommed onto them and has done something with them, but that's where it was at. And so it was like, we count one for a win, because sometimes Book Talk's suggestions are weird. But I was all for those. So, well, Caitlin, I'm so glad to have you back on the show. Again, I mean, I have been a proponent of your work since Luminous Dead. I love your prose. I love the way you approach fiction. And I also am always particularly enamored with authors who do not stay in a lane. The environments of them, the worlds that you create, the types of stories that you tell are always different, and I really, really like that. So again, thank you for the good work, and thank you for joining me on Fictitious.
Thank you for having me.
Links to buy Last to Leave the Room are in the show notes, episode blog page, and YouTube description. I use affiliate links, so purchasing through those supports my work on this program, but I always encourage you to shop your local bookstores whenever possible. Every episode of Fictitious is available at fictitiouspodcast.com, along with more info about the books and authors, and all of the relevant links to follow and support them. You can subscribe to the show on all the major podcasting platforms, including Apple Podcasts, Spotify, YouTube, Google Podcasts, Audible, and Amazon. If wherever you listen has the option to leave a comment or review, please share your thoughts. All of that feedback supports my work on the show, amplifies the work of my guests, and is very much appreciated. You can follow the show on Instagram and Threads as @FictitiousPod, and on Blue Sky as @FictitiousPodcast.com. The Twitter account is updates only at this point, but that's @FictitiousPod as well. At this point, I think a large percentage of the writer community has migrated to Threads and Blue Sky, the former being heavily populated with indie authors, and the latter leaning more towards traditionally published authors. Both platforms have thriving conversations about writing and publishing, so if you haven't checked them out yet, I really suggest you do. Next episode, I'm talking with Merle Lafferty about her sci-fi murder mystery novels Station Eternity and Chaos Terminal. Subscribe now so you don't miss it. Until then, I'm Adrian Buskey. Thanks for listening to Fictitious.